Elena Carter had always believed in slow-burning love, the kind that didn't require grand gestures or viral hashtags to validate its depth. Raised by her widowed schoolteacher mother in a quiet suburb of Oregon, Elena grew up on warmth, empathy, and the belief that kindness could build empires. Her childhood was calm, thoughtful, structured. Weekends were filled with books, old jazz vinyls, and volunteering at the local shelter. She graduated top of her class in marketing and pursued her dream of launching a travel branding consultancy one day, but life, as it often does, had other plans. Meeting Caleb Ford during their final year at university felt like destiny. He was ambitious, charming, and could code entire financial models in his sleep. They clicked instantly, two driven souls with different temperaments but complementary dreams. Caleb taught her spontaneity, she gave him patience. Within 3 years, they were married. 2 years later, they welcomed Noah, their son, with Elena's sea-glass eyes and Caleb's mischievous grin. From the outside, it looked like a perfectly scripted modern love story. But perfection, Elena would come to learn, is often edited for public viewing. Beneath the soft morning cuddles and social media-worthy vacations, fissures began to form, quiet and slow, like the way ivy grows through brick. Caleb, now a fast-rising tech consultant traveling from Seattle to San Diego to New York every month, became increasingly distant. He stopped asking about Elena's day and brushed off her idea for a travel storytelling platform as a hobby that doesn't scale. He missed parent-teacher meetings, skipped anniversaries under the excuse of emergencies, and often responded to Elena's emotional check-ins with tired sarcasm. Elena, juggling Noah's preschool, consulting part-time for a local brand, and managing the home, began to feel more like an assistant than a wife. Their communication became bullet-pointed logistics: milk, Noah's playdate, tax returns, Caleb's dry cleaning. Somewhere between work trips and lost bedtime routines, their partnership lost intimacy. And yet, Elena kept holding on, remembering the Caleb who used to leave sticky notes on her mirror with poems, the man who once cried when Noah took his first steps. But love, she would later learn, isn't just about memories, it's about what remains when time burns away the fantasy. The final unspoken truth began settling in Elena's bones like an early frost. Caleb was changing, but not in the way couples naturally evolve. He was building a version of his life where she and Noah were slowly becoming background characters. He started dressing sharper, his scent a mix of ambition and expensive cologne, often checking his phone during meals, smiling at texts he wouldn't show her. Their weekends, once spent hiking trails and making homemade pizza, turned into solitary hours where Caleb claimed he needed to focus and decompress. Elena's attempts to reignite their spark, surprise dinners, new lingerie, even couples therapy suggestions, were met with dismissiveness or subtle ridicule. "Not everything needs fixing," he once said coldly. She knew something was shifting, something silent and dangerous. But what haunted Elena most wasn't the distance. It was the feeling that Caleb had already made a decision in his heart and was simply waiting for her to catch up to the heartbreak he no longer had the courage to speak aloud. Bianca Reynolds wasn't the type of woman who turned heads for the obvious reasons. She didn't flaunt, she calculated. 29, striking but not traditionally beautiful, she moved through corporate spaces like a shadow in silk, charming, observant, always 3 moves ahead. Born in Philadelphia to a career-driven father who was hardly ever home and a mother addicted to appearances, Bianca had learned early that vulnerability was a weakness and charm was a weapon. After earning her MBA, she became a corporate liaison for tech infrastructure firms, positioning herself as the bridge between aloof CEOs and demanding venture capitalists. That's how she met Caleb Ford, at a panel event where she spoke passionately about the intersection of client retention and ethical innovation. Caleb had been on the panel, visibly impressed by her poise. Their handshake lingered, their banter felt natural, and their first post-event drink, although professional in appearance, hinted at a chemistry neither of them cared to admit at the time. What began as a few work calls and overlapping projects turned into Caleb forwarding her memes late at night, and Bianca laughing a little too hard at his jokes over espresso breaks. She steadied him, not just the professional Caleb but the man underneath the blazer. He was ambitious, methodical, and visibly bored with routine. Bianca noticed how his tone softened when he mentioned his son, but also how he paused when talking about his wife. "She's great," he once said, eyes drifting, "just different." Bianca never pushed. She knew how to let silence work for her. She started sending him articles he'd find intellectually stimulating, left subtle compliments buried in emails, occasionally brushed his arm in passing during meetings. She became the confidant Elena no longer was, feeding Caleb's ego in the exact way he craved. And slowly, without fireworks or scandalous texts, Caleb began leaning more into Bianca's attention, and further out of Elena's orbit. The emotional affair had started, long before any physical betrayal, and by the time Caleb realized how deep he was, Bianca had already carved out space in his life that felt irreplaceable. Bianca wasn't in love with Caleb, not truly, but she loved the game, the validation, the thrill of being chosen. She convinced herself that Elena was holding him back, tethering him to a life he no longer aligned with. Bianca never openly disrespected Elena. She played the part of the curious colleague, never overstepping in public. But privately, she was strategic. She learned Caleb's routines, his frustrations, and the places he felt most alive. She booked meetings near rooftop lounges with moody jazz, places where Caleb forgot to check the time. And when the first kiss happened, it was almost mechanical, mutual, electric, forbidden. Caleb, guilt simmering beneath the surface, told himself it was a mistake. Bianca told him it was destiny. From that moment, everything changed. Texts became secretive. Business trips extended into weekends. Caleb started rewriting the narrative of his marriage, telling himself Elena had stopped seeing him, when in truth, he had stopped looking. Bianca didn't need to steal Caleb. He walked willingly, led by pride, seduced by something that glittered like love but was really ambition dressed as desire. It happened on a Sunday morning, under a sunlit sky that should have promised peace. Elena had taken Noah to brunch at the Elms, a family-friendly hotel cafe where they often shared pancakes and drew silly faces on napkins. Caleb had said he was in Chicago for a last-minute meeting, claiming his weekend was packed with back-to-back investor calls. But as Noah gleefully chewed on a strawberry, he waved excitedly at a woman across the room. "That's Auntie Bianca. Daddy's friend. She gave me candy yesterday." Elena's smile froze mid-bite. She followed her son's finger, and there, half hidden behind a tall potted fern, was Caleb, seated beside Bianca, sharing a bottle of wine in the middle of the day. The distance between their bodies, the way their laughter spilled like it had no conscience, and the intimacy in Bianca's hand gently brushing Caleb's collar, it wasn't just business. Elena's stomach turned. And for the first time in years, something inside her didn't just hurt, it cracked. Back home, the walls felt like strangers. Elena sat on the edge of their marital bed, numb, as Caleb returned that evening with the stench of denial and expensive wine on his shirt. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She asked questions with unsettling calm, each word calculated like a scalpel. "Were you in Chicago?" Caleb faltered. She asked again. "Did Noah imagine you and Bianca together yesterday?" He looked away, his jaw clenched, muttering something about her being dramatic and insecure. "You've changed," he added coldly. "You're too safe, too predictable." "I'm suffocating." Elena wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him feel even a fraction of her confusion, her betrayal, her loss. But instead, she nodded slowly, walked over to their closet, and began packing. Caleb didn't stop her. Not even when Noah asked why Mommy was folding clothes into suitcases and whispering on the phone with Aunt Jasmine. That night, Elena left her home, her comfort, and the man she once called her anchor, not out of hate, but because she realized love that demanded silence in exchange for loyalty wasn't love at all. In the quiet of her car as she drove away, Noah asleep in the back seat clutching his stuffed bear, Elena allowed herself a single tear. Just one. Not for Caleb, but for the woman she used to be, the one who believed love was meant to be endured, even when it hurt. Her phone buzzed with Caleb's message, "You're being impulsive. We'll talk when you've calmed down." She turned it face down and never replied. Instead, she drove to Jasmine's apartment, where a small guest room waited, cluttered with toddler toys and warm energy. Jasmine opened the door without asking questions and just hugged her. Elena didn't know what tomorrow held. She had no job lined up, no plan, just a child, a broken heart, and a mind that had finally chosen itself. But something sacred had awakened, an ember of self-respect long buried under sacrifice. The storm had broken, and she wasn't running anymore. She was walking through it, head held high. The first morning in Jasmine's two-bedroom apartment was a far cry from the quiet, sanitized routines of Elena's former home. A teething toddler screamed down the hall, the smell of burnt toast filled the kitchen, and the sound of a neighbor's faulty plumbing echoed through the walls like distant thunder. Yet, somehow, the chaos felt alive, more honest than the emptiness of her marble countertop kitchen back at Caleb's. Elena stared at the ceiling for several minutes before forcing herself out of bed, Noah still curled beside her, his breathing shallow and peaceful. That morning, Jasmine handed her a mug of coffee, strong and bitter, with no sugar, just like the truth she had chosen. "He doesn't define you, Elle," Jasmine said softly. "You do." They didn't need to say Caleb's name. Elena was still bleeding from the emotional wound, but she was also breathing again. Inhale. Exhale. For the first time in years, she felt her lungs fill with something other than silence. Elena knew she couldn't afford to collapse, not with a 6-year-old watching her every move. After settling Noah into a new public elementary school 3 blocks away, she began applying for freelance marketing gigs, small businesses, nonprofits, travel blogs, anyone willing to trust her with their voice. But competition was brutal, and rejection emails rolled in with unkind efficiency. Still, she kept moving. Every morning at 5 a.m., she'd wake before Noah, tiptoe to Jasmine's cluttered dining table, and grind out proposals with a worn-out laptop and a $12 second-hand mouse. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She rewrote resumes, joined networking forums, and even agreed to a branding consultation for a local vegan cafe that paid only in food vouchers. At night, she lay awake worrying about bills, about school supplies, about whether Noah missed the bigger house or noticed that his bedtime stories now came with shadows of uncertainty. But even in the anxiety, there was clarity. This struggle, unlike the slow death of her marriage, had a purpose. It was rebuilding, not running. Through it all, Jasmine became her anchor. Fierce, hilarious, and unapologetic, Jasmine was everything Elena had once feared being: bold, brash, unfiltered. She'd survived her own heartbreak, Noah's godmother, a trauma nurse who raised her son alone after being left pregnant at 24. Her advice was unorthodox but effective. "Grieve later," she said one night as they folded laundry. "Right now, your only job is survival." Elena found unexpected strength in their late-night talks over melted ice cream and bargain wine. And when she finally landed her first paid gig, a full campaign revamp for a niche travel gear company, Jasmine threw a mini celebration with dollar store balloons and mismatched cupcakes. Noah beamed. Elena cried. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't a luxury life, but it was earned. Slowly, brick by brick, she was rising. Not perfectly. Not without scars. But with integrity, and most importantly, with Noah watching, learning that sometimes life breaks you not to end your story, but to rewrite your beginning. At first, Bianca believed she had won. Caleb was now entirely hers, no more secret meetups, no awkward glances at industry events, no sneaking around behind the back of a wife who had, in Bianca's mind, clearly lost her touch. They moved in together within weeks of Elena leaving. Caleb insisted on a luxury high-rise apartment with skyline views and floor-to-ceiling windows, as if the height could make them forget the wreckage below. Their days were filled with lavish brunches, rooftop parties, and vacations to Napa Valley and Cabo. Bianca documented everything. Social media became her theater, filtered sunsets, champagne flutes clinking midair, carefully captioned couple selfies, each post a declaration that she had arrived. But behind the gloss, reality slithered in. Caleb rarely laughed the way she expected. He was polite, even generous, but emotionally vacant. She'd catch him zoning out during dinners or checking his phone late at night, eyes lingering too long, his smiles not quite reaching his eyes. Bianca tried to fill the void with extravagance, new wardrobes, home renovations, designer perfume that cost more than her old rent. She pressured Caleb about engagement rings, hinting during conversations, even browsing rings on shared devices by accident. But he deflected with work excuses, pushed proposals to the back burner, saying, "We've got time." And suddenly, Bianca began to notice what she had never intended to see. The man she thought she stole wasn't emotionally present. He was more focused on quarterly reports than the relationship they'd built on adrenaline and secrecy. When she tried to reignite the passion that once burned between them, Caleb responded with indifference, or worse, distraction. She realized she didn't know how to connect with him beyond the thrill of what they used to be. Without the affair to bind them, what remained was a shell of two people playing parts. Their conversations grew shorter. Their shared jokes faded. Their world, though polished and curated, began to feel alarmingly hollow. Bianca had spent so much time trying to replace Elena, she hadn't paused to wonder if she'd ever truly mattered to him beyond convenience. Still, Bianca clung to the illusion. She hosted couple dinners to compete with the married friends in Caleb's circle, some of whom only barely concealed their skepticism about her. She would overhear whispers when she left the room, "She's the reason his marriage fell apart." At work, people congratulated her with forced smiles, but the tension was unmistakable. And Caleb, he was starting to show signs of emotional fatigue. He slept in more often, answered questions with grunts, and buried himself deeper into his laptop. The intimacy that had once been electrifying now felt performative. Bianca would watch him from across the kitchen island, his face half lit by the screen glow, and wonder what, or who, he was thinking about. One night, after a charity gala, Bianca leaned into him, perfume and pearls and perfection, and asked softly, "Do you love me?" Caleb paused, too long, and offered a diplomatic, "You make me comfortable." That was the moment Bianca realized she may have won the chase but lost the game. And what stung most was the creeping suspicion that somewhere out there, Elena was still the woman living rent-free in his mind. The airport terminal buzzed with delayed flight announcements, restless travelers, and the collective exhaustion of people stuck in transition. Elena stood near gate 23 with Noah clutching her hand, his tablet long dead and patience even deader. Their flight to Portland had been delayed 3 hours, and Elena, already running on minimal sleep and a freelance deadline looming, was trying hard to keep it together. That's when she heard the faint sound of a child crying uncontrollably. Not Noah, this was a different voice, sharp and panicked. Across the aisle, a girl, maybe 9, was hysterically sobbing while a sharply dressed man struggled to calm her. Passengers stared, annoyed. Elena instinctively stepped forward. "Hi," she said gently, crouching near the girl. "Want to show me your necklace? It's beautiful." The girl blinked, still sniffling. The distraction worked. Elena asked for her name, Maya, and learned she was scared of flying alone. "She's not alone," the man said. "I'm her uncle. Her mom had an emergency." Elena smiled politely and calmed Maya with small talk about clouds shaped like rabbits. Only later did she notice the man's watch, a rare Patek Philippe, one she'd once written about for a brand she consulted. But the man himself was more interesting than the watch. That man was Grayson Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Global Logistics, a multi-billion-dollar supply chain conglomerate known for its sustainability innovations and quiet dominance. He was tall, impeccably groomed, with a deep voice that carried influence without arrogance. And yet, there was something raw behind his composed gaze, something bruised, almost haunted. He introduced himself simply as Grayson, thanked Elena for stepping in, and offered to buy her and Noah something from the lounge cafe. She declined but appreciated the offer. For the next hour, they sat across from each other near the window, exchanging polite smiles while watching their kids play near the chairs with paper planes. Grayson eventually leaned over and said, "You're good with kids. That kind of calm isn't common these days." Elena laughed softly, brushing hair from her face, still unaware of who he really was. As boarding was called, Grayson reached into his carry-on, pulled out a sleek white envelope, and handed it to her. Inside was his business card, ivory embossed with clean lettering. Scribbled in pen beneath it were the words, "You handled that like a queen. Let's talk sometime." On the flight home, Elena held the card in her hand longer than she intended, tracing the curves of the letters with her thumb. She hadn't felt seen in years, not as a mother, not as a woman, and certainly not as anything beyond someone holding everyone else together. But Grayson had looked at her like she wasn't invisible. She did a quick Google search out of curiosity and nearly dropped her phone. Forbes 40 under 40. Founder of Sinclair Logistics. Philanthropist. Widower. The pieces snapped together, the elegance, the watch, the composure, the grief behind his politeness. She swallowed hard, unsure what to make of it. She had no intention of calling him. Her life was chaotic enough. But something about the encounter lingered in her spirit like the warmth of an unexpected sunbeam on a winter day. Noah leaned against her shoulder and whispered, "That man looked like a superhero." Elena smiled. Not a superhero, she thought, but maybe the start of a story she wasn't ready to write. Yet. 3 weeks passed before Elena saw his name again, Grayson Sinclair, this time in a completely different context. Her freelance marketing work was beginning to pay off, and she had just secured a contract with a boutique branding agency that specialized in eco-conscious logistics and emerging sustainability startups. The firm was small, energetic, and full of quirky talent, exactly the type of environment Elena thrived in. She was asked to attend a pitch meeting for a new investor who was funding a multi-million-dollar green transport initiative. When she entered the minimalist conference room in downtown Seattle, she expected to meet another tech-obsessed VC in a Patagonia fleece jacket. What she didn't expect was to see him, Grayson, standing by the whiteboard, flipping through slides with the composure of someone who had built empires and buried heartbreak. Their eyes met. Recognition flickered. She wasn't sure whether to speak first, but he gave a small nod and a knowing smile, and just like that, the air changed. It wasn't attraction, it was familiarity, a quiet reminder that sometimes strangers are just chapters waiting to be written. Throughout the presentation, Elena kept her focus razor-sharp, knowing every slide, anticipating every question. She refused to let the moment dull her professionalism. But she couldn't ignore the subtle shift in Grayson's tone when addressing her specifically. "Ms. Carter, your previous work on the Travel Loop campaign was one of the cleanest narratives I've seen in a while." "That's rare in this business," he said before continuing. A few raised brows from colleagues confirmed that compliment wasn't part of the usual meeting script. After the presentation, as the team dispersed, Grayson approached her near the coffee table with 2 espressos in hand. "Still good with nervous children and terrified investors, I see," he said with a soft laugh. She smirked, brushing imaginary lint off her blazer. "Well, caffeine helps." He paused. "I wasn't expecting to see you here. But I'm glad I did." Before she could answer, a phone rang, his assistant pulling him away. "We'll talk soon," he added, handing her the espresso and walking out with that same composed stride. Elena stood there a moment longer than necessary, surprised by how warm her hands felt holding the cup. Later that evening, as she tucked Noah into bed and logged into her client dashboard, Elena noticed an email flagged with priority status. It was from Grayson's personal address, subject, consultant opportunity. The message was short, deliberate, and carried no trace of flattery, just a direct proposal to have her lead the branding relaunch for one of Sinclair Logistics' sustainable product lines. It was one of the most high-profile contracts she'd ever seen. She reread the email twice, then closed the laptop. Her heart beat faster, not out of romantic tension, but because of what this moment represented. She wasn't being seen as a shadow of her former marriage, or a woman scraping her life together post-divorce. She was being acknowledged for her mind, her work, her voice. The possibilities scared her, but not enough to say no. Somewhere in the glow of her modest apartment, with her son's soft breathing in the background and a quiet email from a man who had lost and rebuilt his own world, Elena Carter felt a flicker. Not of love, not yet. But of becoming someone new. Caleb Ford had always believed success was the ultimate measure of worth, and by every external standard, he was thriving. His tech consultancy had landed 2 major contracts, his name often appeared in financial journals, and he lived in a high-rise apartment with floor-to-ceiling views of the city skyline. Yet, despite all the luxuries, something gnawed at him, a hollow space he couldn't name but felt every night when he turned off the lights. The emptiness wasn't just about Elena's absence, it was about what she took with her when she left. Noah's laughter no longer echoed through hallways. The warmth of a family meal, the quiet comfort of someone who understood him without words, all of it was gone. Bianca tried to fill the void with expensive wine, curated date nights, and shallow flattery, but none of it felt real. Caleb found himself scrolling through social media late at night, stopping on posts of Elena's freelance achievements and Noah's milestones, each update a sharp reminder of what he had carelessly abandoned. What unsettled Caleb most wasn't just Elena's resilience, it was how radiant she looked. She wasn't the timid, soft-spoken woman he remembered from their last fight. Her eyes, even in casual photos, gleamed with determination and independence. In one video, Noah was laughing while helping her test a product for a client, his tiny voice calling her the coolest mom ever. Caleb felt a strange pang, a mix of pride and regret. It wasn't just that Elena had rebuilt her life, it was that she had done it without him, and perhaps better because of it. Bianca noticed his wandering thoughts. "You've been distracted," she remarked one evening as they sat at a rooftop restaurant. "Still thinking about her?" He denied it, but his tone was unconvincing. The truth was unavoidable. Bianca, once his thrilling escape, now reminded him of everything hollow in his life. Caleb started questioning if leaving Elena was ever about happiness or if it was simply about feeding his ego, an ego now bruised by watching her thrive without his presence or approval. That night, as he stood on his balcony with a glass of bourbon, Caleb replayed the last year like a movie he couldn't pause. He remembered Elena's face the day she walked out, not angry, not even bitter, just done. There had been something hauntingly final about her silence, and now, seeing her succeed, he wondered if she had known all along that he would regret it. His phone buzzed with a notification, LinkedIn updates showing Elena's new contract with a prestigious brand, backed by a name he recognized, Grayson Sinclair. Caleb's stomach tightened. He knew of Grayson, every ambitious man in business did. The billionaire was as untouchable as he was brilliant, and Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that Elena's world was expanding in ways he could no longer influence. He didn't say a word to Bianca, but as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, one question looped through his mind like an unwelcome song: what if she finds someone who treats her the way I never did? The invitation came wrapped in soft cream-colored cardstock, with gold calligraphy that shimmered under sunlight. Private estate garden dinner, Sinclair Vineyards, 7 p.m. At first, Elena hesitated. Grayson had mentioned a small, intimate dinner to celebrate the soft launch of his eco-logistics line, just close colleagues, investors, and a few friends. He told her to bring Noah too, assuring her the estate had open lawns and an outdoor cinema set up for kids. Elena wasn't used to this world of polished exclusivity, but something about Grayson's voice on the phone, warm, unhurried, made her say yes. That Saturday, dressed in a simple midnight blue dress and Noah in a little blazer he picked himself, they arrived at the vineyard estate nestled on a sun-drenched hillside outside the city. It was like stepping into a dream, firelit lanterns hanging from oak trees, long harvest tables lined with fresh roses and crystal glasses, soft jazz drifting through the vines. Yet, the most striking thing wasn't the scenery. It was how Grayson's eyes lingered when he saw her, as though the evening had been waiting just for her. Dinner was elegant but relaxed. Noah played in the grass with other children while the adults mingled over wine and roasted sea bass. Elena sat beside Grayson under the open sky as he poured her a glass of his family's signature vintage, the candlelight dancing against his suit. They spoke of business at first, then drifted into laughter and stories from childhood. Elena shared tales of her mother's stubborn optimism and growing up with little but dreaming big. Grayson opened up about the years after his wife, Laurel, had passed from an aggressive cancer, how he'd thrown himself into work not out of ambition, but survival. For the first time, Elena saw the man behind the title. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, but a human being who had lost and dared to live again. Sometimes, he said, we don't rebuild because we're strong. We rebuild because it's the only way to keep breathing. She looked at him quietly, her hand resting beside his on the table. In that silence, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual recognition of brokenness, endurance, and reluctant hope. As dessert was served, Noah returned from the cinema area, sleepy but content, his small hand finding Elena's. He looked up at Grayson, then back at his mom, and said with sleepy honesty, "I like him, Mommy. He makes you smile like the old days." Elena's throat tightened. Grayson bent down to Noah's level and ruffled his hair gently. "It's an honor to meet a gentleman like you," he said, and for the first time, Noah hugged him, without prompting, without hesitation. Grayson was visibly moved, his posture softening as he looked at Elena again. The gesture was simple, but the weight of it cracked something wide open in both of them. That night, as the evening drew to a close and guests slowly left under starlight, Grayson walked them to their car. "I hope tonight gave you more than a good meal," he said. Elena turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "It gave me peace." They held each other's gaze a second longer, neither needing to explain what they already knew. Something was beginning, and it was no longer just about healing. Jasmine Morales had always worn resilience like armor. A single mother by 24, a trauma nurse by 26, and a fiercely loyal friend for life, she didn't have the luxury of slowing down. Between double shifts, daycare pickups, and offering Elena sanctuary when her world collapsed, Jasmine rarely had time to think about herself, let alone love. But fate had a sense of humor. During a routine community fire drill hosted by the local department, Jasmine collided, literally, with Leo Carter, a rugged fire chief with a crooked smile and eyes that hid his own share of pain. Their introduction wasn't romantic. Jasmine had snapped at him for nearly knocking over her medical kit, while Leo had accused her of storming in like a hurricane. But underneath the sarcasm was intrigue. He wasn't just confident, he was grounded, funny, and observant. For the first time in years, Jasmine found herself stumbling over her words, unsure of her usual walls. Their paths kept crossing, on call-outs, at neighborhood meetings, even in the grocery store where Leo's daughter, Lily, mistook Jasmine for a Disney princess. Slowly, the tension softened. They shared coffee outside the hospital between shifts, where Jasmine discovered Leo was widowed. His wife had passed 5 years ago in a car crash, leaving him to raise Lily alone. His grief, though older than hers, mirrored her own in unexpected ways. He didn't romanticize survival. He lived it. Jasmine, who had always prided herself on independence, was shocked by how easily she could lean into someone else's presence without losing herself. Leo never pushed. He simply showed up, in quiet gestures, and listening, and taking over daycare pickup when she had a late shift. One evening, he dropped off a homemade stew with a post-it that read, "For the strongest woman I know, strong people need care too." Jasmine stood in her kitchen for 10 minutes, staring at that note. Her chest ached in a way she hadn't felt since before her son was born. It wasn't just about romance, it was about being seen, deeply, without conditions. Elena noticed the change almost immediately. Jasmine laughed more, slept better, even wore lip gloss again. They sat on the fire escape one night with paper cups of wine, watching the city breathe beneath them. "I thought I was too much for someone," Jasmine admitted. "Turns out, I just needed someone who wasn't afraid of the fire." Elena smiled, her own heart lifting as she watched her best friend rediscover joy. Their journeys were different, but they were walking side by side, each woman proving that healing didn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes, it came in little hands tugging your dress, and burnt coffee, and sarcasm from a man who smelled like cedar and safety. Jasmine hadn't planned on falling in love again. But sometimes, the best chapters were the ones life wrote when you weren't looking. And for the first time in years, she was excited to turn the page. Bianca Reynolds prided herself on being in control. Her calendar was color-coded, her wardrobe flawlessly curated, and her Instagram feed a living art exhibit of perfect lighting and curated smiles. But control was beginning to slip. Caleb was changing. Slowly at first, canceling date nights with vague excuses, staying longer at the office, responding to her jokes with distracted nods. Bianca noticed, but instead of confronting it, she doubled down: more lingerie, more reservations at five-star restaurants, more flirtation laced with desperation. She wasn't used to chasing. She was the prize, the upgrade, the one he left his wife for. Yet now, she felt like a placeholder in her own story. It began to consume her. One night, after Caleb fell asleep on the couch again with his laptop open and dinner untouched, Bianca did what she once swore she never would: she opened his phone. What she found wasn't scandalous, but far worse. A string of LinkedIn searches, updates about Elena Carter, and a paused video of Noah reading from a children's book. The next morning, Bianca confronted Caleb not with rage, but with a calculated blend of sarcasm and accusation. "Tell me, Caleb," she said while pouring coffee, her voice like ice under silk, "do you still think about your ex-wife when you're with me?" Caleb didn't even flinch. He looked tired, bone-deep weary, as if the foundation of whatever they had built was too heavy to carry. "Don't do this," he muttered. But she pushed, needing to hear it, needing validation or war, anything but silence. "You're obsessed with her," Bianca snapped. "Scrolling through her life like she's still yours. She's not. You chose me. Remember?" Caleb stood there, unmoved, and that silence said everything. The worst betrayal wasn't cheating, it was indifference. Bianca's voice broke as she added, "I made you my future. Was I just a distraction?" Caleb exhaled slowly, not cruel, but detached. "You weren't supposed to become the same thing I was running from." That sentence, spoken so plainly, shattered something inside Bianca. She realized then that she may have won a man physically, but emotionally, she had never truly held him. The days that followed were strained, silent, suffocating. Caleb stayed out longer, took calls in private, and no longer responded to Bianca's affection. She began spiraling in isolation, scrolling through Elena's public posts, comparing outfits, resumes, even the way Elena carried herself, so composed, so untouched by the chaos Bianca now swam in. One night, unable to sleep, Bianca booked a facial at a wellness spa known for its emotional clarity packages, a sign even she would later laugh at in bitterness. But during the session, as she stared into the white ceiling surrounded by cucumber mist and ocean sounds, the truth struck her with violent force. She had confused Caleb's dissatisfaction with his marriage for love for her. She hadn't been chosen, she'd been convenient. And now, with every glance he gave to his past, she was being quietly erased. Bianca left the spa without finishing the treatment, mascara smudged and dignity cracked. For the first time, she didn't feel like the upgrade. She felt like a temporary chapter he was trying to rewrite. Elena never imagined her name would appear on a legal document beneath the words "custody petition filed." The envelope arrived without warning, delivered by a courier who barely looked her in the eye. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Caleb hadn't spoken of shared custody, and despite his growing distance from Bianca, he had never expressed a serious desire to rebuild a relationship with Noah. But there it was, cold, sterile language accusing her of limiting Caleb's access to their son, framed as a concern for emotional development. Behind it all, Elena saw the fingerprints of Thomas Ford, Caleb's high-profile father, a former corporate lawyer turned media consultant who viewed legacy and image as sacred currency. "He's trying to repair his reputation," Jasmine said angrily. "You're not a mother to them. You're a liability." Elena felt fear, but also fire. She wasn't just protecting her child, she was defending the world they had rebuilt from ashes. And no court document would intimidate her into silence. The courtroom was painfully pristine, white walls, silver plaques, a judge who looked too young to understand the stakes of motherhood. Caleb entered with his lawyer and father in tow, dressed immaculately, his face unreadable. Elena sat beside her attorney, Meredith Chon, a sharp but empathetic woman who had once fought a custody battle of her own. The opening statements were brutal. Caleb's team argued that Noah's living environment was unstable, citing Elena's freelancing, shared apartment space, and lack of financial consistency. It felt like knives cloaked in formality. Elena clenched her jaw, refusing to let them see her cry. When her turn came, Meredith rose and calmly dismantled each claim, presenting Elena's consistent income growth, glowing testimonials from clients, school performance records showing Noah thriving, and even letters from neighbors and Noah's teacher describing a home filled with love, structure, and support. Then, they called Noah's pediatric therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Keating, who testified that Noah displayed emotional intelligence, security, and trust, especially when speaking about his mother. "He talks about his mom like she's his hero," Dr. Keating said. Caleb looked away. But it was Noah himself, unplanned, unscripted, who delivered the final blow. During a recess, he tugged the judge's robe in the hallway and asked, "Will they make me live with someone who only visits me to ask about homework?" The judge, startled, invited the boy into chambers for a private word, as protocol allowed in family court. When they returned, Caleb's expression had changed, no longer stoic, but fragile. He whispered something to his attorney, who rose and asked for a quiet adjournment. Minutes later, the judge ruled to maintain Elena's full custody, with Caleb retaining limited visitation rights until he demonstrated consistent emotional involvement. Elena didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply held Noah's hand and walked out of that courtroom with her spine straight, her dignity intact, and her soul quietly shattered and mended all at once. Caleb stood behind, alone, his father's hand on his shoulder. But even Thomas Ford's grip couldn't anchor him now. Caleb had entered that courtroom seeking redemption through control. What he found instead was the beginning of accountability, and the echo of a child's honesty ringing louder than any lawyer's argument. Victor Sinclair returned to the States like a gust of wind that unsettled everything in its path, dressed in navy wool, fresh off a red-eye from Geneva, and carrying more concern than luggage. At 36, Victor was Grayson's younger brother by 3 years, but the lines around his eyes made him look older. A former investment banker turned risk analyst for a Swiss conglomerate, he had always played the role of the family's internal compass, calculated, cautious, and brutally honest. When he first laid eyes on Elena during a Sinclair Logistics board mixer, he was disarmed by her poise and quiet intellect. But behind his polite smile lingered unease. That night, over bourbon and silence on the Sinclair estate balcony, Victor confronted his brother. "She's different, yes," he said. "But don't act like you're ready when you haven't buried your ghosts. You swore you'd never feel again, remember?" Grayson sipped his drink without meeting his eyes. "I didn't think I could. Until her." Victor didn't smile. "That's what worries me." The next day, Victor requested a private coffee with Elena. She hesitated, sensing formality in his tone. They met at a quiet waterfront cafe, where Victor cut straight to the point. "I'm not here to intimidate you," he said, "but I need you to know what you're stepping into." He shared the story behind Grayson's silence. The wife he lost, Laurel, had been pregnant with their first child when she collapsed from a brain aneurysm during a holiday dinner. It was sudden, brutal, and entirely unpredictable. For 2 years afterward, Grayson spiraled, not publicly, but quietly, methodically. He became reclusive, turning his grief into empire building. Victor, watching from Europe, feared that love, any love, would become a trigger, not a refuge. "He rebuilt the world around him like a fortress," Victor said. "And now that you're in it, I need to be sure you're not here to knock it down. Even unintentionally." Elena sat in stunned silence, her fingers trembling slightly around the ceramic cup. She hadn't known. Grayson had spoken of loss, yes, but not like this. Not the raw, merciless version. And yet, she couldn't walk away from what they had started. It wasn't pity she felt, it was something deeper. A tether not easily cut. That evening, Elena stood at the window of her apartment while Noah played quietly behind her. Her thoughts spiraled, not out of doubt in Grayson's feelings, but in her own capacity to carry someone else's grief while managing her own. She wasn't a stranger to heartbreak. But this was different. This wasn't betrayal or failure, this was death, and the memory of a child that never took a breath. Could love blossom in soil where sorrow once rooted? She didn't know. But when her phone vibrated and Grayson's name appeared with the message, "Dinner tomorrow? Just us." "No business," she typed back 2 words, "I'd like that." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was a step forward. Small, but intentional. And though Victor had meant to plant caution in her heart, what he had done instead was reveal how much Grayson had survived. And survivors, she thought, often loved with a depth that didn't scare her, it mirrored her own. The past didn't frighten her. What terrified her more was not trying. The morning began like any other, sunlight spilling into the apartment, cereal crunching in Noah's bowl, and Elena reviewing emails at the kitchen counter with her coffee growing cold beside her. But by mid-afternoon, everything unraveled. Noah had returned from school quieter than usual, rubbing his stomach and refusing dinner. Elena assumed it was a bug, something mild and passing, until he woke at 2 a.m. in a cold sweat, vomiting and clutching his side, his small frame trembling. Panic roared in her veins. She bundled him into the car with shaking hands, heart pounding as she sped to Seattle Children's Hospital, barely noticing the red lights she ran. At the emergency room, the nurse moved quickly, recognizing Noah's symptoms. Suspected appendicitis. The word hit Elena like a thunderclap. In less than 15 minutes, Noah was wheeled away for scans, and Elena stood frozen in the waiting area, her breath caught in her throat as monitors beeped behind sterile doors. Her son was in pain, and she felt helpless. Grayson arrived 20 minutes later, no questions, no hesitation. Elena had called him from the hospital parking lot, her voice cracked and barely audible. He didn't speak when he reached her, didn't ask for details. He simply placed his hand over hers, grounding her. His presence was steady, calming, like standing near a lighthouse in the middle of a storm. But what neither of them expected was Caleb to show up an hour later, shoulders squared, eyes bloodshot. He had received a message from Elena's frantic voicemail, one she barely remembered leaving, and now stood at the ER entrance like a ghost from a parallel life. Grayson gave him a nod of recognition, then stepped back. Caleb approached slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is he?" Elena cut him off gently. "They're running tests. Appendicitis." The 3 of them sat in silence, a triangle of tension, history, and love, none of them knowing where they belonged in that moment. Noah's pain had cracked something open, something none of them were prepared to face. And yet, all 3 were there, waiting, hoping, silently tethered to the same heartbeat behind those doors. The surgeon emerged 2 hours later, confirming it was indeed appendicitis. Surgery was scheduled within the hour, minimally invasive but necessary. Elena nodded, gripping the consent form, trying to hold herself together as Noah was wheeled away in a tiny hospital gown, his hand reaching out for hers. Grayson gave them space. Caleb stepped forward, brushing Noah's forehead and whispering, "You're gonna be brave for me, okay?" Noah nodded, then looked back. "Tell Mr. Grayson not to leave." That sentence changed something. Caleb blinked, stunned, but said nothing. After Noah was taken to surgery, Caleb asked Elena if he could stay until the operation was done. She hesitated, then agreed. The waiting room became sacred ground, shared memories, quiet truths, and fractured roles colliding in painful silence. At one point, Caleb said, "Thank you for being his constant." Elena looked at him. "He's not my constant, Caleb. He's my purpose." Outside, the night sky remained still, but inside, something irreversible had shifted. They were no longer just a broken couple with shared custody. They were witnesses to a child's pain, and that truth demanded honesty, whether they were ready for it or not. 2 weeks after Noah's surgery, life began to return to its fragile rhythm. The stitches healed, the hospital room became a memory, and Noah was back to chasing sunlight across the apartment floor with toy trucks. But something within Elena had shifted. Watching both Caleb and Grayson sit in the same waiting room, listening to Noah ask for Grayson in the same breath as his father, it had stirred questions she wasn't yet ready to name. So when Grayson invited her to join a private weekend retreat with his inner circle on a yacht anchored off the Washington coast, she hesitated. Just friends, he clarified, voice soft. I need air. And I'd like to share some of it with you. She accepted. It wasn't just about getting away, it was about seeing who they were outside hospitals, boardrooms, and past wounds. On a calm Friday afternoon, Elena boarded the yacht with a simple bag and a restless heart, unsure of what she would find but ready to face it. Grayson's closest friends were nothing like she expected. Selene, the widowed wife of Grayson's former best friend, greeted her with open arms and a wicked sense of humor that cut through tension like sea wind. Mark, Grayson's longtime strategist, was direct, thoughtful, and surprisingly emotional when speaking about Grayson's journey. They didn't treat Elena like a stranger, they welcomed her like someone who had been missing from the table. Over shared meals and late-night wine on the deck, stories flowed. Elena shared moments about Noah's first steps and the time she failed her driving test 3 times. They laughed, not at her, but with her. And when Grayson took her hand that night to guide her toward the bow of the ship, where the stars painted streaks across the sea, she didn't resist. There, surrounded by salt air and silence, Grayson finally said what had been lingering in every gaze. I don't know if I have it in me to love the way I did before. But with you, I want to try. Elena didn't answer with words. She stepped closer and kissed him. The kiss wasn't grand or scripted, it was soft, tentative, like two people finding their way across a bridge made from pain and possibility. When they pulled apart, Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of the sea and him. I'm not asking you to erase her, she said, her voice trembling. Just don't erase yourself trying to forget. Grayson nodded, eyes glassy. I've done enough forgetting. That night, they didn't make promises. They just existed, close, real, present. The next morning, as sunlight spilled across the waves, Elena woke on the deck with a blanket over her shoulders and Grayson beside her, still asleep. She didn't know what the future held, if the world would try to rip this piece apart or if her heart could handle the weight of loving again. But she knew one thing for certain, this wasn't a rebound or an escape. This was something honest. Something born not from need, but choice. Bianca stood in front of Elena's apartment building wearing an ivory trench coat and designer heels, gripping her clutch like it held the last of her dignity. She had rehearsed what she would say 100 times, but the words were already unraveling in her mind. Elena hadn't expected visitors. When she opened the door, her face registered only brief surprise before shifting into calm neutrality, the kind of composed strength that unnerved Bianca more than any scream ever could. We need to talk, Bianca said, forcing a smile too wide. Woman to woman. Elena didn't respond immediately. She stepped aside wordlessly, letting Bianca enter the apartment where Noah's school art projects hung proudly on the walls. Bianca's eyes darted around, searching for flaws, for weakness. She found none. You think you've won, don't you? Bianca began, her voice low but sharp. You left your marriage in ruins and now you parade around with a billionaire like grief is just some fashion trend. Elena crossed her arms, her eyes unwavering. I didn't win anything, Bianca. I survived something. But Bianca wasn't listening. Her carefully constructed mask cracked as she launched into a tirade about Grayson, about how Elena was manipulating her way into the elite, pretending to be some wounded saint while seducing men who deserved better. Her voice rose with each accusation, until Noah emerged from his room, rubbing his eyes. Mommy? He asked, voice small. Bianca froze. Elena walked to Noah and kneeled beside him. Go back to your room, sweetheart. This woman was just leaving. But Noah didn't move. He looked at Bianca, then at Elena, and said, Is she the one Daddy said was a mistake? Bianca paled. Before she could respond, the door opened behind her, and there stood Caleb, wide-eyed and furious. He hadn't come to see Elena. He had followed Bianca's phone location after sensing something was wrong. What the hell are you doing here? He barked. Bianca stumbled over her words. I wanted her to know that you're unstable? Caleb snapped. Congratulations. Message received. The fallout was swift. Caleb didn't wait for explanations. He took Bianca by the elbow, dragged her outside despite her protests, and left her standing in the hallway, humiliated and shaking. But what followed was worse. That night, while Bianca sobbed on the edge of her bathtub, Caleb overheard a phone call, Bianca laughing, mocking Noah's voice, telling a friend that playing family with a kid who still wets the bed was a nightmare. She didn't know he had returned to grab his keys. She didn't see him standing in the doorway, frozen with disgust. The next morning, Bianca woke to an empty apartment, Caleb gone, his things packed, her key deactivated. She called, texted, begged. No response. Her final message read, "I gave you everything." Caleb replied with a single sentence, "And you still managed to destroy it." Bianca dropped the phone, her chest hollow. She had played every card, crossed every line, and burned every bridge. What she didn't realize, until now, was that some wars aren't worth winning when the battlefield is made of ash. Caleb didn't fall apart in one dramatic collapse. His unraveling was quiet, stretched over sleepless nights and hollow days where time moved, but he didn't. After Bianca's final betrayal, he moved into a furnished corporate apartment, sterile, gray, a place that felt more like punishment than refuge. His once busy schedule cleared up as clients noticed his diminishing spark. For the first time in years, he had no one to impress, no one to argue with, and worst of all, no one to come home to. He spent his evenings staring at the muted TV, whiskey untouched in his glass, replaying memories he used to ignore, Noah's third birthday when Elena had baked a cake shaped like a spaceship, the night he got the promotion and she danced with him in the kitchen barefoot, the time she wept silently when he canceled their anniversary to fly to Denver. These were the details he'd once considered forgettable. Now they played on a loop, sharp and unforgiving. He reached out to his mother, Linda Ford, one evening, not out of obligation, but desperation. She hadn't taken sides during the divorce but had warned him, quietly, that good women don't wait forever. She arrived the next morning with groceries and a long stare, walking through his apartment like a detective scanning the scene of a crime. "You don't look like yourself," she finally said. Caleb leaned against the wall, ashamed. "What if I ruined the only version of me that was ever good?" Linda didn't rush to comfort. Instead, she reminded him that real men don't chase forgiveness like a trophy, they earn it through reflection, humility, and change. "You can't undo the pain, Caleb," she told him. "But you can stop pretending it didn't matter." That night, Caleb sat alone and wrote something he never thought he would, a letter. Not to win Elena back. Not to plead. But to acknowledge. He poured every word carefully, his failures, his blindness, the depth of his regret, and most importantly, a quiet thank you. Thank you for being the one who gave him the best version of a family before he knew what to do with it. When he mailed the letter, he felt no relief, only fear. He didn't know how Elena would respond, or if she would respond at all. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't even believe he deserved it. But something about sending the truth into the world felt necessary. He needed Elena to know that he saw her now, the strength, the grace, the pain she'd hidden behind silence. And he needed to admit to himself that he had been the architect of his own emptiness. Days passed, and the silence that followed was louder than any scream. Yet, strangely, it brought clarity. He started therapy, for himself, not as a PR move. He showed up to Noah's games, not to impress Elena, but because he finally realized that fatherhood wasn't a title, it was a presence. For the first time, Caleb was trying to become someone his son could respect, not because he won back what he lost, but because he learned what it meant to truly lose. The chandeliers glowed like molten glass inside Maison de Lune, the city's most exclusive fine dining establishment, where the wine list read like a novella and reservations were booked 3 months in advance. Caleb Ford had been there before, but never like this. Tonight was an awkward attempt at civility with Bianca, who had begged for one last dinner to explain, to apologize, to offer closure. Caleb, now emotionally removed and numb, agreed out of politeness, not hope. He wore his gray suit without care, the usual polish missing from his movements. Bianca arrived in a crimson gown that shimmered under candlelight, her eyes desperate for redemption. "Let's just pretend," she said with a strained smile, "that we're not ghosts to each other." Caleb barely responded. The waiter led them to their table near the fountain centerpiece. As they sat, Caleb's eyes drifted across the room, idle, detached, until something in the distance snapped his entire body alert. There, by the grand piano, stood Elena. She looked ethereal in a sapphire gown that moved like liquid against her skin, her hair swept back in elegant waves. And standing beside her, with absolute poise and reverence, was Grayson Sinclair. The lights dimmed. The pianist played something soft and orchestral as Grayson guided Elena forward, stopping directly under the high arch of roses that crowned the restaurant's atrium. Silence washed over the room as Grayson pulled something from his coat pocket, a small, velvet box. Gasps followed. A few camera phones discreetly lifted. Bianca sat up straight, eyes narrowing in disbelief. Caleb could no longer move. He watched as Grayson sank to one knee, his hand trembling only slightly as he opened the box to reveal a diamond that seemed to shimmer with its own breath. "Elena Carter," Grayson's voice echoed just enough, "you gave me a reason to believe in tomorrow. I want to give you the rest of mine." Elena covered her mouth, tears shimmering as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. The restaurant erupted in quiet applause. Caleb's heart didn't just sink, it imploded. Bianca turned slowly toward Caleb, her face awash in cruel realization. "You didn't come here for closure," she said coldly. "You came to convince yourself she wasn't really gone." Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't. His gaze remained fixed on Elena, now wrapped in Grayson's embrace, her eyes shining with joy he never gave her. For the first time, Caleb wasn't filled with anger or jealousy. He was filled with clarity. All the rationalizations, the arrogance, the distractions, they dissolved in that moment like fog under sunlight. He had underestimated her. He had dismissed her quiet strength, her capacity to rebuild, to be chosen by someone who saw her fully. And now, here he sat, across from the woman who had helped him destroy everything, watching the woman he once vowed to love be celebrated by a man who meant it. Caleb pushed back his chair slowly. "Enjoy your meal," he murmured to Bianca, before walking out of the restaurant, into the cold, alone, with the sound of applause still echoing behind him. 3 days after the proposal, Elena sat at her favorite corner of Indigo Cafe, the same quiet place she once visited to cry in silence after leaving Caleb. Now it held a different energy, light, calm, and oddly full circle. She sipped her herbal tea and stared at the city skyline, absently rubbing the engagement ring Grayson had slipped onto her finger. It wasn't about the diamond, it was about what it represented. Choice. Respect. Growth. That morning, she'd received a letter at her doorstep. Handwritten. From Caleb. She had stared at the envelope for hours before opening it. Inside, he had poured his soul, no excuses, no apologies shaped to win her back. Just truth. A confession of blindness, pride, and a deep understanding that he had not just lost her, he had forfeited the chance to know the woman she was becoming. It ended with one line: "You were the only part of my life that ever truly mattered. Thank you for loving me when I didn't know how to love you back." Elena didn't respond immediately. But she knew she had to see him, once, not as exes or enemies, but as two people with shared history who needed a proper goodbye. They met at Discovery Park, near the cliffside trail where they once walked hand in hand during their early days of dating. Now, they stood feet apart, no longer tethered by resentment or longing, just mutual understanding. Caleb looked thinner, quieter, but clearer somehow. "Congratulations," he said softly, gesturing to her hand. Elena nodded. "Thank you." There were no raised voices, no apologies demanded. Just silence, and in that silence, truth. "I was so focused on what I thought I needed," Caleb said, "I forgot what I already had." Elena's eyes misted, not from sadness, but from peace. "And I thought if I loved you hard enough, it would be enough to make you stay." They sat on a nearby bench, letting the wind braid itself between their final words. Caleb finally whispered, "I don't expect you to forgive me. But I needed you to know. I see it now. Everything. Elena placed a hand briefly over his, not with affection, but with closure. I forgave you the day I chose myself, she said. But thank you for finally seeing me. Caleb smiled faintly, blinking hard. He stood, shoved his hands in his coat pockets, and took a long breath. Take care of him, he added, meaning Noah. Always, she replied. Then, without another word, Caleb walked away, his steps light, not because he was healed, but because he had finally let go of the illusion that he could rewrite the past. Elena stood there a moment longer, the ring glinting in the late afternoon sun. She wasn't just someone's ex-wife anymore. She was a mother, a woman in love, a survivor of her own storm. And she had earned her joy, not through revenge or replacement, but through choosing peace over pride. As the wind swept over her skin, she closed her eyes and whispered to herself, now. I'm ready for forever. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Sinclair Eco-Village Initiative headquarters, casting warm gold across the polished wood floors and rows of hand-carved desks made by local artisans. Elena stood quietly at the front, watching volunteers help children plant trees in biodegradable pots for Earth Day. What began as a small conservation dream had blossomed into a nationwide movement, reclaiming neglected land, building animal shelters, supporting green startups, and reviving rural communities. Behind the scenes, Juliet, Grayson's chief of staff, ensured everything ran with strategic brilliance, while Nora, now head of youth outreach, organized monthly storytelling circles for underprivileged kids. Rachel, now director of compliance at Nova Volt, remained unshakable and loyal, working side by side with Juliet as if they had been sisters in a past life. Elena, now creative director of Sinclair's branding division, no longer saw herself as someone recovering from heartbreak, but as a builder of legacy, mother of a thriving son, and partner to a man who had chosen her with eyes wide open. Their wedding took place on a sun-kissed cliffside in Mendocino, California, where waves clapped against rock and wildflowers nodded as if in agreement. The ceremony was simple, intimate, just 50 guests. Jasmine stood beside Elena in a plum satin gown, her own diamond sparkling after Leo proposed during a firehouse fundraiser the week before. Celine and Mark shared a toast that left everyone in tears, and Noah, dressed in a tiny tuxedo with his hair slicked back and a matching boutonniere, walked his mother down the aisle. He stood beside Grayson during the vows, tugging his sleeve right before the I do to whisper, "Are we a real family now?" Grayson knelt, holding Noah's hands, and said, "We always were." When Elena said her vows, she didn't promise perfection. She promised presence, patience, and partnership. And when they kissed beneath an arch of eucalyptus and rose, the applause wasn't loud, it was full of reverence, a collective breath exhaled by everyone who had witnessed both their storms and their sunrise. Later that evening, while lanterns glowed beneath oak trees and Noah danced barefoot in the grass with Lily, Elena sat beside Grayson at the head of a long wooden table covered in laughter and wine-stained napkins. She looked around, at Jasmine laughing uncontrollably at one of Mark's dry jokes, at Celine slow dancing with her new boyfriend, and at Caleb sitting quietly at the far end of the table with a date who looked at him kindly. They had all survived something. Some kind of loss, some kind of ending. And yet, here they were, blooming again. Grayson leaned into her ear and said, "You still carry that quiet fire." Elena turned to him with a smile that needed no words. Her heart was no longer mending, it was whole. Not because of the man beside her, but because of the woman she had become. The music swelled. Noah laughed. And as stars took their place above the vineyard, Elena finally exhaled. She had arrived. This was not a return. This was a beginning. The end.